we continue our examination of music throughout history by looking into the art and music of the Romantic era. It's important for you to know that the Romantic era has nothing to do with boxes of chocolate and flowers and sappy love songs. The Romantic era does have a lot of influence from expressiveness and emotions as people became more aware of their purpose and individuality. Our objective is to identify distinguishing characteristics of music from the Romantic era. When we began, we talked about music from the Baroque era. We determined that music was fancy, ornamented, and embellished. Then we moved forward to the Classical era and discovered music that was quite different because it was simple, symmetrical, and balanced. In 1820, something drastically different must have happened again. So what was that? The Romantic era was characterized by strong emotions and expressiveness. So our focus words: emotions and expression. A timeline of the Romantic era is revealing of all of the many, many, many important things that were happening in history at this point. The Romantic era was a time of many important developments, some of which include electricity, light bulbs, manufacturing, assembly lines, the telegraph, the typewriter, the telephone, and the ice machine. Other notable inventions include rain jackets, zippers, escalators, washing machines, and the gas-powered motorcycle. You can see in this slide, Coca-Cola was created during this time period in 1886. And then specific to music development and entertainment development, in 1827, the microphone was invented. In 1878, the phonograph, which was a listening device. 1878 also saw the development of moving pictures, which we would know more as movies. In 1881, camera film was developed. 1885, the automobile was developed, allowing musicians to travel more readily. And in 1887, the gramophone was developed. There's a picture on the left of a gramophone. This allowed people to listen to music in their own homes. In 1895, the motion picture camera was developed, so we could record performances and events and play those back when we wanted to view them. Society at the time. People began to react against the rule of privileged people and nobility. Many artists were dedicated to communicating the goodness that existed in humans. Women began to develop a sense of worth, whereas before, many opportunities were not available to them. Growing social interests focused on liberty, the freedom of individuals to make the best choices for themselves. Many people were inspired to speak out against poverty as well. So in general, people are beginning to grow a sense of how important every person is in the world, not just people with authority or wealth. And they're beginning to have the time to become entertained, and the ability to travel, and the ability to listen to recordings. And it makes their world quite a bit smaller and much more familiar to our lives. In architecture, an interesting development happens. There's an imitation of previous styles represented in the photograph on the left. You'll notice that building doesn't look too different from the buildings we viewed from the classical era. There's a sense of symmetry, accepting that there's some expressiveness and emotion in the different heights between the towers. And on the right, you see a representation of a folly, which was an eccentric building. This building was actually constructed around 1900 right here in Massachusetts in the United States. It was meant to imitate the look of a castle, even though by 1900 There weren't too many castles being built of stone in this fashion. In art, people express emotions in several different ways. The picture on the left by Eugene Delacroix, one of the most famous French artists of the time, he's actually painted a picture of a composer and an author. George Sand is a pseudonym because women authors were not as well received, so she wrote under the name of a man. And in this portrait, you notice a lot of dark colors. That was characteristic of art from the time. But you'll also notice one of the first things your eyes was drawn to was the big, deep red curtain in the background. That pop of color creates a sense of emotion when we look at the picture. And in the picture on the right, Rainstorm Over the Sea by John Constable, you see a lot of heavy brush strokes. We also see a landscape. Landscape paintings were very big at the time because people were very interested in the power of nature. And this artist has captured this by using really heavy brush strokes. Again, really dark colors, but you can also imagine standing on a beach watching a storm come in. In music, composers were very emotional. They developed many different ways to indicate expression or to communicate expressively. There was a lot of invention going on in the way that sounds were used. Maybe instruments were used differently, but they were also used in different ways. You might combine instruments that weren't combined before to create a new sound. There were many extra musical ideas, meaning that if I were writing a piece of music, I might be telling a story. I might have a melody that represented a character or a melody that represented a place. And I would use my music to paint a picture for you to imagine. That's an extra musical idea. So what you hear has a little bit of depth to it. Composers were very interested in the glory of nature. So there are many pieces inspired by walks through nature. Individualism, of course, we said was a big ideal of the Romantic era. And then the orchestra also began to grow larger. In addition, the materials they were using to make instruments became better with the improvement of things like steel to make strings or the brass that was used to make instruments of the woodwind and brass family. You can see in 1832, the modern flute design was established. In 1835, the tuba was invented. Not until then. We've gone 235 years with no tuba. And now we finally get to hear those deep, deep sounds. In 1846, the saxophone came about, which is why we've also not heard the saxophone, even though in modern music it's become a very popular instrument. So again, those focus words, emotion and expression. Our composer focus. One famous composer of the time is Johannes Brahms. He lived from May 7th, 1833 to April 3rd, 1897. He was a German composer, pianist, and conductor who was very shy and reserved. While he began composing at the age of 11, he later destroyed his compositions out of embarrassment. He had the unique experience of once falling asleep when another composer and pianist, Franz Liszt, was performing. He dedicated 21 years to composing his first symphony. His best friend Clara Schumann was also a composer. And interestingly, Brahms was intimidated by the music of our previous composer from the classical era, Beethoven. Brahms felt that his music was never good enough to stand against the music of Beethoven, which is one of the reasons it took him 21 years to write his first symphony. What else did Brahms write? Let's take a peek. In that Looney Tunes excerpt, you heard the music of Brahms from his Hungarian Dance No. 5. And the expressiveness and emotion that you heard in that music was prompted by differences in dynamics, contrast, and in tempo. You heard some changes in tempo. It felt kind of unsteady at times. Sometimes it was slow, sometimes it was fast. Pay attention to the same sort of thing in this excerpt from his first symphony. In that music, you're able once again to hear a lot of contrast, a lot of tension, because of the expressiveness and emotions that Johannes Brahms is trying to communicate through music. You might have noticed when we moved from a strings focused back to the woodwinds, there's a sudden change and a sudden release of the tension. This became a very important characteristic of music during this time. A second composer from the time period is Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. He was born May 7th as well, 7 years after Brahms, and died on November 6th, 1893. Tchaikovsky is the first Russian composer we've spoken about. An interesting fact is that during his guest conducting appearances, he would hold his hand on his head because he feared that it would become detached from his body, which would of course be terrifying for everyone in the audience and the orchestra, and I guess it would be pretty terrible if it was your head leaving your body as well. During his lifetime, his work received harsh criticism. His music did not fit the sound ideals from Russia, and that caused some trouble for him during his career. In 1891, during a trip to America, he conducted in Baltimore, New York City, and Philadelphia. This also makes Tchaikovsky the first composer that we've discovered has come to the United States of America, because there is now a scene in our developing country that allows for entertainment and performances. And there's the technology for travel that allowed Tchaikovsky to travel all the way from Russia to the United States of America. His music is famous for its emotional and dramatic melodies, like the one that we were just listening to. And he is one of the greatest composers of all times for ballets. Here's an example of ballet music that Tchaikovsky composed from the Nutcracker. That music was later used in the first Fantasia movie produced by Walt Disney. And a final musical example from the work of Tchaikovsky. It's from a ballet that he wrote for Romeo and Juliet. Again, you were probably able to hear a lot of the expression and emotion in those samples. To summarize today's lesson, music of the Romantic era can be described as expressive and emotional. Much of this is achieved by the way the composers use contrasting elements of music. So very loud sounds, but also very quiet sounds within the same piece of music. They might also have music that changes tempos at times to make you think differently. And it might at times seem really super tense. You might imagine a composer was excessively happy when they wrote a piece of music, or maybe they were even angry. And this was all okay during the Romantic era. People were very aware of their emotions, and they were quite comfortable having a chance to express what they were thinking and feeling. Two famous composers of the Romantic era include Johannes Brahms and Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Don't forget that although you've watched this entire presentation, you are required to submit a written assignment. Read and respond to a brief text about Romantic era composer Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Check your on-course classroom for assignment details. Remember, incomplete or late work will not receive full credit. We are approaching the final weeks of our class, and we need to begin to develop better practices for our move forward into our second quarter classes. Please turn your work in on time and complete it. And finally, remember that your best effort is always expected. If you have any questions, please email me at my school account or send me a message in On-Course Classroom. I'm happy to help you through your work. Be well. I look forward to seeing you all soon.